I'd like to welcome all of you to The Independent. You know, this panel is always fun for me. They're a bright group of folks. Robb, who is a national columnist who does a great discussion about conservative issues on the national level. And then we have Professor Thompson at ASU, who has a great background in international issues. Today, we're going to talk about everything from the overturn of the tariffs by the United States Supreme Court, all the way to talking about vouchers for homeschooling and for private schools in the state of Arizona. And last, we're going to end with a discussion that came out of The Economist on inequality. You know, one of the things that I love about what we've been doing with the Independent Party is I love challenging my own assumptions. I can tell you that I'm not always right. I don't have any problem with recognizing that sometimes some of my points of view might be out on the edge, but I always enjoy learning. And these two guys are really good at being able to teach you about different subjects from a variety of different viewpoints. Now, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. That's part of why we've been doing this Independent and the Independent Party. If you like what we're doing, press the subscribe button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome my panel here today. Again, we have Lord Henry here who's with us. Is young Arthur at the house today, or are you childless at the moment?
Well, like many Arizona families here in Phoenix at the moment, Paul, I'm relieved that my kids are back in daycare because I don't know if you have experienced it at your house, but a lot of people's kids have been sick with flu.
Oh my gosh.
My kids had it as well, and my wife has had it. So I'm just happy at the moment. Everyone seems to be recovered and back in daycare. So all is back to normal around here.
Yeah, I had a half a dozen grandkids with me this weekend, and sure enough, I got a cough today. So never
Good
fails.
luck.
Yeah,
Good luck.
Good luck. All right, Bob, how you doing today? My favorite columnist. We're going to talk about a couple of your columns today. How you been doing? You're in Phoenix today?
We're in Phoenix and enjoying the nice weather as we're on the precipice of reaching the 90s in February. That's kind of unfathomable.
Yeah, it's I mean, like when I go run and the temperature is like 68, I feel like I'm freezing. Yeah, right? In Phoenix, you don't know what to do with that weather. I'll have on a sweater and a coat and everything else. This is a big week for both Donald Trump and the Republicans. This week, we're going to have Donald Trump doing his State of the Union. And he's doing that in the face of a bombshell week where last week the United States Supreme Court overturned his tariffs, or at least the major way in which he's been able to implement the tariffs. That is going to have a big effect on quite a few things. I actually think that it could have been an advantage for him had he been willing to just blame the Supreme Court and moved on with the taxes that he's placed on business through tariffs. But he's taking another approach. That approach is going to put this issue smack dab in the middle of the Republicans or Republican-controlled Congress right before the midterm elections. So what I'd like to start by doing is getting all of your opinions on this whole concept of what happened with SCOTUS this week and what your view was as to whether or not that's going to advantage or disadvantage the Republicans. And Bob, I'll start with you.
Well, I confess that I am really dreading the State of the Union address for many reasons, but this decision is one of them. I think one of the more embarrassing and troubling aspects in our political life was when Barack Obama lectured the Supreme Court about the Citizens United decision in a State of the Union address. And this is teed up for something that's 10 times worse. Several members of the court are now boycotting the State of the Union. I don't know whether I wish that the entire court would boycott this particular State of the Union, whether that would be worse for political comity, but I am really dreading it. what I think the decision actually illustrates is the difficulty bordering on futility of curbing Donald Trump's excesses through the courts. He announced these Emergency Act tariffs on April 4th. We're 10 months later. Billions of dollars, estimated $130 billion, has been collected. He has used it to roil our relationships with practically every country in the world. And the decision was very narrow. It was just on the question of whether the powers that he has under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act included tariffs. Well, irrespective of whether they include tariffs, what he did with the act was contrary to the intent of Congress and contrary to the allocation of responsibilities in the Constitution. The act was intended for true crises. The language is unusual and extraordinary threats. One might argue that applied to the fentanyl-related tariffs that he applied, but in terms of the balance of trade tariffs that he imposed under that act and serially changed, there's no argument can be made that those were any of those things. They weren't unusual. They weren't extraordinary. They weren't a threat. And certainly the Constitution doesn't contemplate, and Congress did not intend to give the president unilateral authority unchecked to set a tariff on every country of any amount that he wants and to change it minute to minute. Yet that larger abuse wasn't addressed by the decision, and he moved immediately into another one. His new tariffs are based on something that has nothing to do with trade, except as a constituent part of a larger formula. It's intended to prevent huge deficits. Large is the term used in the act itself for balance of payments, not trade deficits. Trade deficits are part of it, but the balance of payment is the overall economic relationship. And includes capital inflows and outflows. Well, it just happens that capital inflows into the United States pretty much offset our trade deficits. There is no large balance of payment problem that this act was intended to cover. So he's just moved from one abuse of power to another abuse of power with the intervention of 10 months of people paying illegal tariffs, roiling our economy, rolling our diplomatic relationship with practically every country in the world. So while in some respects it's cheering that the Supreme Court decided there was a line, the fact that what he got away with and where he immediately moved suggests that the court drawing lines isn't going to do much to constrain his abuses of power.
Bob, it was, one of the things that we saw this week, Henry, was that a number of the other countries who were supposed to have trade meetings with the administration backed out of those meetings until they more fully understood the ramifications of what was taking place. How do you think people are seeing this offshore in terms of the Supreme Court voting against the existing president? Is it seen as a positive, a negative? What's your view of that?
Well, I think it depends how much people overseas know and understand American politics. If you read the financial press from Frankfurt or London, they say, oh, finally, it took the Supreme Court a long time to knock down these illegal tariffs. But of course, that's a relatively small segment of the population, and even in Europe, that understand the role of the Supreme Court in American politics. I'd say most people still just have this pretty overarching impression that the United States under Donald Trump is a very unpredictable partner in national security and in trade and economic relations, and they just don't know how to approach that. The French and the Germans are now talking about the transatlantic alliance essentially being irrevocably changed or undermined or even broken. And I don't think that this changes anything about that in the short run. My personal opinion on this is that Trump should have, in a way, taken the win that the Supreme Court gave him, which was a way to back out of these tariffs that were causing a lot of chaos in international trade and probably not a good thing for the economy. And the timing of the Supreme Court decision could have been just in time to help bail out the economy for the midterms. So if I had been on Trump's team, I would have said, blame the Supreme Court, say you wanted the tariffs, rail against the Supreme Court, but take the win. Let the economy recover without the headwind of the tariffs through the midterms, and it might be enough to carry the Republicans back to keep the House. But instead, he's decided to double down and try and implement a different set of tariffs, as Bob described, which is just causing even more chaos in the markets. Today, we see that the markets are down another 1% or 1.5% because they simply don't know, right, what's going to happen with tariffs in the future. So I think that Trump should have allowed the Supreme Court to save him from himself, so to speak, but he doesn't seem like he wanted to let them.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, I admit the optimistic side of me tries to look at where the silver linings are here. I agree with you. The best thing he could have done for his midterms would have been to have blamed the Supreme Court and talked about how he had this great plan, and if there's a downturn now, it's their fault. But move on to talking about other issues with affordability. It's not lost on me, and I can't imagine it's lost on him. 2/3 of Americans do not like these tariffs. They see tariffs as being a negative for the economy and a negative for them in terms of cost. Bob, here's one of the silver linings that I saw, and you can counter this. I'd like to hear your opinion of it, but I saw there as being two silver linings. The first one is, I have said this over and again, maybe Donald Trump thinks he's an authoritarian, but like it or not, he's the head of a democratic government. There's still a democratic government here, a constitutional government. And the idea that the Supreme Court voted against him and two of his own members voted against him seems to be an indication to me that we still have a functioning republic. That's not to say that, his erratic behavior isn't damaging to us, but that should be a signal to the rest of the world that the rule of law does exist and that the Supreme Court's willing to overrule them. And the other thing that I found to be interesting that maybe you could comment on is this major questions doctrine. I increasingly like Gorsuch. I just think Gorsuch is a really good justice. But one of the things that he did in this was he pointed out how the people on the right and the left were inconsistent with their past positions. The idea of the major questions doctrine from the right, his argument was, you guys have been arguing for this, and this is clearly a president who is going beyond the authority that was given to him. And his argument with the left was, why wouldn't you have applied the same thing to student loans or to environmental issues? I like the idea that he's basing his idea or his vote on principle. Your thoughts on both of those?
Well, I think that the most important silver lining is that a degree of uncertainty has been removed. None of the authorities that Trump can now employ permit him to set tariffs at any rate he chooses and change them at any time that he wants to. The balance of payment tariffs are capped at 15%. They only last for 150 days. All the other authorities require a process so that people won't be surprised. They will know what's being considered, and they are subject to public comment and review and challenge. So I think the most important silver lining is that a degree of uncertainty has been removed, and people will have economic actors, owners of business, won't be so much subject, and foreign countries, to the shock of waking up in the morning and finding out that the tariff on your import or your export from a foreign country has doubled overnight because the president had an episode of dyspepsia over the course of the night. In terms of the opinion itself, I am not a fan of the major questions doctrine. It is better than what preceded it, which was almost total deference in the case of any ambiguity to what an administrative agency claimed the law permitted them to do. It's better than that. But the relative separation of powers roles shouldn't depend upon, as in the major questions doctrine, the size of the consequence. Even agency decisions that may have little consequences considering the economy or the body politic as a whole have major consequences for the people who are involved in them. And I think that the scrutiny, the requirement of a clear expression of authority for the executive branch to act, statutory authority, should apply universally. It shouldn't depend upon some unspecified test that the court has invented as to when you cross the magical line in terms of the consequences and significance of the decision. And all of a sudden, we're going to apply a greater degree of scrutiny as to whether there is statutory authorization for it. So the other problem I had with Gorsuch's opinion was that I think that was one of the things that delayed the decision from coming out. He really didn't add anything to Roberts' plurality opinion. He just took time to slap about 6 of his fellow justices for supposed inconsistencies. So they all had to respond to that. Barrett's concurring opinion only responded to Gorsuch's criticism of her supposed inconsistency. So I'm fearful that a little bit of the delay was a result of him playing gotcha with his fellow justices without really adding to the meat of the decision.
So your opposition to the major questions doctrine is almost a little more of a libertarian point of view. It's that it should almost be exact. It shouldn't be just the major questions. It should be any questions. Did I understand that right?
I'm just grateful that we have someone like Bob on the show who can explain this stuff to me. I know far less about the U.S. Supreme Court than both of you, and than I probably should. So I just sit here and listen and learn. One of the benefits of being on the show. Thanks, Bob. Send me your bill for instruction later on.
No doubt he can do that very well. Did you see any silver linings in it, Henry, in the decision itself?
I agree with all of these basic points, that it's good that this particular use of tariffs has been ruled out for the future. It's good that the system works, right? We have checks and balances. I guess at the margin, it's also good that the size of the tariffs is now also going to be under control rather than having anything, some of the proposed tariff levels that Trump had up to 200% on certain countries at certain times was just sort of unrealistically high. So I don't think that the tariffs cause as much economic damage as people thought they were going to, probably because compared to other countries, the US is not as dependent on trade with other countries for its economic growth. But at the same time, at the margin, they definitely were hurting, and it's a good thing for us to get past all of that as fast as we can. And I agree with Bob that these new authorizations to make tariffs are much narrower and for a shorter amount of time than before.
Bob, the one of the points that seem clear to me is that this tariff, where we can extend it for 150 days, puts that decision point right about July. I can't imagine that if I were a Republican running for Congress today, that I wouldn't feel like our bus was being driven off the cliff here. That it's just highly problematic to not move on, and instead you're going to put it front and center right before the election. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think politically, this is not thinking many steps ahead, because you're right. It comes right at the important part of the midterm elections. Gives the Republicans a very tough vote, and highlights an issue on which they are vulnerable. So it's politically a very bad mistake. Now, I think because of the balance of payments language in this particular authority rather than balance of trade, that there's a chance that there will be an injunction and a chance that the Supreme Court won't lift the injunction. It is more obviously a misuse and abuse of the statutory authority than the reciprocal tariffs were. So we may be in litigation again, and there is a very strong prospect that after 150 days, Congress will not act, and on the 151st day, Trump will claim the authority to do exactly the same thing, start over with another 150 days. If I were to predict highly, without any confidence whatsoever, what the future course is, it is that there will be 1 day of no tariffs under this particular act in 150 days, and then they will be either reimposed, or he will fast track the other authorities he has to inaugurate an entirely different regimen of tariffs under other authorities to replace the balance of payments authority that he has currently invoked.
I think there's one sort of big open question or almost great irony of what has happened with these tariffs, which is that many people think that Donald Trump, the rise of Trump in 2016 in the beginning, was in a way a repudiation of globalization, right? That it was these areas of the US that had been ravaged by deindustrialization, the export of manufacturing to China especially, that those were the areas, the swing districts that went for Trump unexpectedly, and that was kind of the swing to his benefit that other people didn't understand, right? That the backlash against trade and immigration was greater than other people thought, and he benefited from that. The great irony of these tariffs being struck down is that, it's now 10 years since that moment, right? Almost since Trump won in 2016. And we still don't have any real coherent system, alternative system of what international trade should look like. There's no proposals from the Trump administration, let alone international negotiations about reforming or replacing the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, any of these international institutions. They obviously are not working the way they used to because the US is undermining them, and they are also being undermined by other actors as well. But what I find really interesting and ironic is that this big repudiation of globalization in 2016, we still don't have an answer then to the question of, okay, then what should globalization look like? I don't think that we have any clarity on that whatsoever. And it will be deeply, deeply ironic if Trump loses the midterms, cannot make any progress on this issue, and a Democratic administration comes in 2028 and is able to resolve that question on their terms rather than Trump's.
Yeah, what I find interesting about the tariff question is that it begins with an assumption that the United States got screwed over. And that really is the assumption that this was devastating for us over the last 30 years. And if you listen to people in his cabinet, they'll talk about it. They'll tie it back to Bill Clinton in 1992 when the GATT agreement was redone, which I had kind of the honor of working on during the time that I was there. But But what happened during that period of time was we did open up more for competition, but at the same time, we gained protection for intellectual property rights and a WTO to try to enforce it. That's paid massive dividends for the United States in terms of protecting Google and Facebook and Meta, all the technology jobs that we've been able to create. And if you look at the numbers, to me, I don't see where we got hurt from it. Our GDP per person back in 1992 was about the equivalent of all the other G7 nations. The wealthiest nations in the world were all about the same. Today, we're about double all of them. The number that I always find amazing is that Mississippi, which is our lowest GDP per person, 58,300, is higher than all of them except for Germany. I just don't see the evidence that the premise is correct. And while that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we should fix, there were areas and places that got hurt. There's no doubt about that, especially in that northeastern section. And by the way, I think that was Trump's genius in 2016. By talking about tariffs, he was able to break the blue wall, because behind that blue wall are the people who are the most opposed to globalism. But if you live in Arizona, you ought to really like globalism, because it's really done a lot of good for us. I mean, we have Intel plants and chip making plants. We've done really well in the global era, as have most of the South, as has California. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have tried to help that one section of the country that maybe got hurt more than the others did. But to me, there was a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater. Bob, you made mention earlier of the effect that this has had on relationships with other countries. And you wrote a great piece this week, which I encourage people to go to Substack and read. Maybe it was last week, but the Europe that we want. Can you talk a little bit about that piece, the point that you were trying to make in it, and the facts that you had to back it up?
I can't really discern what it is that the Trump administration wants in terms of our relationship with Europe. And I'm terribly worried about the consequences of what I believe is the ad hoc policy that they are pursuing without any firm view of what they want Europe to look like in the future and what they want our relationship with that Europe to be. And to get back to a point that you made, Paul, Donald Trump has described the European Union as basically a conspiracy to screw over the United States. And it reflects a animosity by Trump and his administration to any of the mechanisms that Europe has developed to take collective action. And they have openly supported the populist nationalist parties in Europe who are opposed to doing anything. They oppose the existing degree to which there is collective action and are adamantly opposed to the things that France and Germany and Great Britain are discussing to try to allow the European countries to act collectively and counterbalance what they see as the revival of great power rivalry. The difficulty that the European countries face is that collectively they're big and powerful. Europe has an economy roughly the size of the United States. They have roughly 100 million more people than the United States. If they can act collectively, they can be a great power. But the Trump administration, while urging Europe to do more to provide for their own defense, seems to be in opposition to the mechanisms by which Europe can act collectively and truly shift some of the burden for security and improve their economic performance. So it seems the net effect of what the Trump administration is doing is to leave Europe weak, fragmented, and vulnerable and as dependent it is now on the United States, but pay more for that dependency in terms of defense spending and in terms of tariffs. That's obviously not a future that has any kind of appeal to the European nations. And I don't think it's the Europe that best serves our interest. I think a strong Europe in terms of national security and a better performing Europe in terms of the economy is the kind of ally that will best serve the United States going forward. And the Trump administration, by their actions, if not their intent, is making that more difficult rather than easier to get to. I think there has been a wake-up call in Europe. I think there is a desire, certainly by the major European powers, to improve their ability to act collectively and to have more heft on the international stage. There's a recognition that they are economically underperforming. But there is a deep sense that something has fundamentally changed in the relationship with the United States, and the United States no longer sees a security interest in the fate and success of liberal democracy in Europe.
Henry, I've always operated on the assumption that our allies, Europe, NATO, Canada, for that matter, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, that while we weren't perfect from their point of view, that we were an ally and that they were more afraid of what would happen with an emerging China, that the totalitarian point of view that they would have, the hierarchy that they would want to establish was so poor for them that they would always lean in the direction of the United States. But with Carney's speech that happened last week, and then what we saw happen, I just was looking at some of the numbers in an article on Germany that is actually doing more with China. And then a recognition that China, while they lost a lot of trade from the United States, they actually had no net loss in exports coming out of their country because other places ended up buying them up. Is that assumption still safe, or do you think that we are at a stage where our allies might start playing more kind of a middle role between us and a China?
Good question. Big picture, there are only really three regions in the world that matter, geopolitically speaking: North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. And the United States has been lucky enough through the Cold War that both of them, Western Europe and East Asia, were America's core allies, right? These are the rich, industrialized parts of the world. Now, what's changed with the rise of China is that there is a new power emerging in East Asia that's following the East Asian development model. It's becoming very large, very militarily powerful, economically developed, etc. And China is seen as a rising challenge to the United States, at least at the moment, as sort of as a strategic peer or even a strategic threat to the United States. And the question is how other countries respond. It's obviously in the United States' interest, if there are really only these three regions that matter, to keep the Western Europeans on side to the extent that they can, and to the extent that they can, that the United States can promote Western European economic development, entrepreneurship, innovation. All those things are good because it contributes to the general division of labor and entrepreneurship within the Western alliance and Western economies. That's good, and the same goes for East Asia. So I agree with Bob that it's not good when relations break down between the US and Western Europe, and all these, rhetoric is tossed across the Atlantic that they're whatever they are, cheese-eating surrender monkeys or, lazy Europeans, etc. But I also wouldn't overstate how much the US can really affect the dynamics in Western Europe or East Asia. A lot of what's being criticized both by the nationalist parties in Europe and by Trump is not so much the economic cooperation, the free market in Europe, as it is the EU bureaucracy, the European welfare states, all these things that are very deeply entrenched. And to be perfectly honest, they're not good for economic growth. They're not good for innovation and development. They have proven pretty terrible for the European defense industrial base. I think the idea that further European integration is going to be good for their mutual defense against Russia, for example, I think is questionable, to be perfectly honest. I think at the moment, the Germans and the French are fighting over their new joint fighter aircraft project that's been going for like 10 years, and they want to throw the whole thing in the trash can because they can't agree to cooperate yet again, right? So the Europeans can't cooperate very well. So I'm not sure how much effect the US can have on those sorts of dynamics. I'm not sure how much effect the US can have on these sorts of dynamics within the EU and to what extent it really matters. But to the extent that the Americans can say nice things, can be supportive of the Europeans, that's always good. I wouldn't really, to be honest, be very fearful that the Europeans are going to turn wholeheartedly towards the Chinese. They need the Chinese to buy their manufactured goods. They need them to buy their various products that they want to export. It's been a big driver of the European economy the last 20 years or so. But geopolitically, I don't think that the Chinese are a very attractive prospect to the Europeans, probably not much more attractive than the Soviets were in their own day, to be perfectly honest. So the Europeans are going to complain. They're going to be angry about the tone of the rhetoric from the United States. But at the end of the day, I think the Europeans have got to get their own houses in order. They've got aging populations, sclerotic economic growth, highly bureaucratic, domestic and international, regional-wide institutions. They've got very underperforming militaries at the national level, almost no cooperation at the EU level. The Europeans have got plenty to work on. I don't think that the Americans should be mean about it. They should be supportive, but I'm not sure how much difference it's going to make in the medium run.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's the old Teddy Roosevelt line, walk softly and carry a big stick. And Donald Trump just doesn't walk softly. Although I think my favorite line was actually by Joe Biden when he was vice president. He said, walk softly and carry a big stick. And he says, and I promise you, Barack Obama has a very big stick. I should know I'm vice president. Poor Joe.
It is worth noting that there's been a parade of European heads of state visiting China. A year and a half ago, that would not be happening.
Yeah, and it's hard to know whether that's just noise or whether or not they're actually trying to revisit their relationships. But what I know about relationships and working with different people is that when you harm the relationship, it has downstream effects. It just does. And if, I try to tell people who work for me all the time, if you're a salesperson and you're transactional, hard to get repeat business. But if you're relationship driven, you're constantly trying to help out your customer, trying to find a way, even though we may have to push back on things that are important to us. But if you have a relationship, the relationship goes a long way to cover up 1,000 sins. So Bob, I'm going to put something up here and I want to ask you a question about it. I want to challenge the narrative here a little bit. Let's put up the poll. All right. So here are the big issues. And you can, the Ipsos poll really shows that Trump is way underwater on all of the big issues, from inflation, tariffs on imported goods. It's like I said, it's about 2/3 against. U.S. relationships with other countries. Even on immigration, he seems to be underwater. The economy, he's underwater. But if you would, go to the next slide, because it's the next one that's interesting to me. And that is that Americans don't trust Democrats any more than they do Trump to handle the problem. As the country's main problems, Trump, 32%, Democrats in Congress, 31%. Neither is a third of the mix. It seems to me that there is actually a lane, either for the Republicans or an independent or anyone else, where Democrats, the public doesn't have a lot of faith in them either. Now, my question to you, Bob, is, do you think that these polls misstate where the numbers really are? And what effect do you think really happens in the midterms if Democrats are really doing this poorly in terms of their performance?
I don't think that it's inaccurate. I think that the body politic is unhappy with the governance that they are getting from Trump and his administration. in our two-party system, the only way that they have to express that is to elect the other party, even when they have no confidence, as reflected in this poll, that they will do a better job. But the feeling that they won't do a better job is less of a motivator than the certainty that you don't like the job that the current guy is doing. And I think the midterm election will be a referendum on Trump and his administration and their performance with which the American people are unhappy. As we've discussed many times on this program, it is unfortunate that the American people only are given the option of going back and forth between two parties that they find unsatisfactory whenever they are in office. And the way in which our nominating system works to provide the final choices aren't serving the country, as those large neither results would suggest. And the American people are increasingly identifying themselves as independents rather than affiliated with either party, even if they happen to be registered with one party or the other. So I don't think this is a bad sign for Democrats leading into the midterm election. They have a comfortable and growing margin when you ask the generic ballot question, which prefer for Republicans or Democrats to be in charge of Congress. All of the special election results are tending heavily towards Democrats. So I think in the binary choice that their political system currently offers, that the Democrats are looking really good for the midterms, even though the American people don't really have any confidence that they'll do a better job.
Yeah, what I find is that you oftentimes, Henry, say that politics is won on the margins, and I agree with that, meaning Mamdani is doing incredible damage to the Democratic Party. This week, he announced his budget. His budget was a huge budget buster for New York. And then, of course, what he did is he said to the governor that it was up to the governor to raise taxes, and if she wasn't willing to do that, that he was going to do incredible damage. And he made the comment to the middle class. And to me, it's just an astonishing argument to hear somebody make. It reminds me of Blazing Saddles when the guy puts the gun to his own head and says, "Nobody move," or "This guy gets it." More coarse than that, but nonetheless, I remember somebody in the audience who was watching him in the movie said, "Don't move. I think he really means it." I think Mamdani really means it. I think he's more than willing to kind of shoot his own constituency to get what he wants in terms of more revenue. And what's really becoming apparent to them is that the ability to continue to tax the upper income group is increasingly becoming harder. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But Henry, your thoughts on that? Your thoughts on whether or not the Democrats, their success is going to be because while they may not trust Democrats, they actually may trust the candidate running in a particular state.
Yeah, I think that this will be a turnout election on both sides. I think that in these off-cycle years, there's going to be more of a race to get your own supporters out to the ballot, especially when the general public is, as these figures show, relatively apathetic. And so I'm going to be really interested to see how each party is able to turn out their voters. On the Republican side, a lot of people would say that without Trump, they're going to have problems. But on the other hand, in many states, Republicans have been racking up pretty impressive increases in voter registration versus Democrats, including in Arizona, but in other states as well, as I understand it. So things might not be as bad for Republican turnout as we might think without Trump at the top of the ballot. But on the other hand, Democrats are very amped up around, especially around the immigration issue and ICE, especially around opposition to Trump, obviously, and the prospect of having a block on Trump in the legislature and Congress is very appealing to Democrats. So it could be that turnout is higher than we expect for this midterm election, which would make things really interesting and would make these independent voters a really critical voter bloc. I like it that you brought up Mamdani, Paul. I almost feel like Trump should invite him back to the White House. They had this nice meeting where one of the reporters asked Mamdani if he still thought that Trump was a fascist, and Trump patted him on the back and said, it's okay, you can say that I am. I think that was one of the funniest moments in American politics of the last year for sure. So maybe Trump, in the run out to the midterms, should just invite Mamdani for regular afternoon tea in the White House, just to keep him in the headlines and make sure that Americans don't forget what the left wing of the Democratic Party has in store for them.
Yeah, and I believe in that whole concept of horseshoe politics. If you go far enough to the left and far enough to the right, they start to actually come back together. And that, to me, I mean, I see a lot of things coming out of Trump that are very left-wing. I used to be in the Democratic Party, and what I find to be interesting is to now see Democrats who are acting as if they're free traders, and who know, maybe they're born again and they actually believe in it. But in my experience, when I came back from the GATT agreement, when we came back from talking about trying to create free markets, labor unions, especially the ones that are more entrenched, they didn't like it at all, and there was a lot of pressure to not open up the marketplace. And I think when you start looking at
the inaugural WTO negotiations in Seattle, right, Paul? The inaugural WTO negotiations in Seattle had to actually be postponed, right? Because the protests by the labor unions and the left wing were so radical in Seattle that they couldn't get the delegates to and from the conference center. This was in 2000, I believe. And so they had to move the whole thing to Doha.
Yeah, I mean, what amazes me is how tribal politics works. This is just an amazing thing to me, because I've never liked tariffs. I've always, but it's probably because I'm from Arizona, and there's no doubt we have benefited from a much more open market. But I didn't like it when Democrats liked it, and I don't like it when Republicans like it. But I'm watching a lot of my Democratic friends who have now kind of become true believers against it, and I'm convinced the only reason they're against it is because he likes it, and if he likes it, it's bad. And I see that a lot in politics on both sides. All right, Bob, I want to go to local elections here just for a little bit. You wrote also an article on ESAs, and I really enjoyed it. Again, you can find that article on Substack, but talk to us a little bit about what you were seeing with ESAs. I know you've been a big supporter of money following the student as opposed to a system that's controlled by government alone. Talk about a little bit about what your position is and why you took a little bit of a contrary position to it in your article.
I am a supporter of universal vouchers, and Arizona was one of the first states to adopt them, in which students who attend private schools and students who are homeschooled can receive taxpayer money to offset their educational expenses. The Arizona program, however, has run into a gigantic public relations problem with what I regard as an indefensible feature in a scheme that I'm generally strongly supportive of. And some anti-voucher groups are sort of seizing this political opportunity to launch an initiative that would cap the program based upon income, and I think even more troublesome, invite more regulation and scrutiny of the internal workings of private schools, by state government. And so my pitch was that supporters of the ESA should reform it where it needs to be reformed. Otherwise, the opponents of the ESAs will seize the indefensible features of it with an initiative that will go well beyond fixing what needs to be fixed. And the major problem has to do with what I think is a fatally flawed way of assisting people who educate their kids at home. For kids that attend private school, it's a very straightforward support. There is money available to help pay the tuition at the private school, and Arizona's private schools are almost completely religiously affiliated and have been in the business of educating students for some time. The overwhelming majority of the students who participate in the program attend private school. The overwhelming majority of the money that is expended under the ESA program goes to pay private school tuition. There's really no problem with that. But the way in which the homeschool section is handled is that the parents decide what educational materials they want to purchase and make application to the Department of Education for approval of those. The volume that is generated in those requests make it impossible for the department to keep on top of them, to process them in a reasonable period of time, and certainly doesn't give them the opportunity. They don't have the staff to police them. So you have two problems. You have parents that argue and complain that they aren't getting their money soon enough because of the time it takes to review the application. And then you've got bad actors who are abusing the program. And this is what's generating the headlines of getting approvals, which are later rescinded for lingerie and jewelry and expenses, vacation, large purchases, high-end pianos. And to me, that system doesn't work. It does create a flaw. It needs to be fixed. And my proposed fix was, instead of making this stuff be approved after the fact, that the department should be charged with coming up with a pre-approved list of educational materials, textbooks, and other enrichment materials for each grade. And that's what homeschoolers can get, only from the pre-approved list. There would be no delays. There would be no abuses. And I think that's a fix that needs to be happened. Another problem that's developed in the system is large unexpended balances accruing in some of these homeschool and special ed accounts. And reportedly, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are simply accumulated and not being spent. And some parents try to convert that into helping to pay for college. Well, that's not what the program's intended for. And certainly a modest degree of carry forward between years might make sense, but these large surpluses shouldn't be permitted to accumulate. They should be swept and returned to the general fund after a certain size and after a certain period of time. The third reform has to do with accountability. And rather than inviting the state into the internal operations of private schools, which the initiative will open the door to, instead, taxpayers ought to know what they're getting for their expenditure. And the reasonable way to do that is to have ESA students take the same academic tests that district school and charter students have to take, and have the results reported in the same way that it's reported for the public schools. The whole idea of the school choice model is that parents and students get to decide the educational environment that's best for them, but it should be an informed decision. And the informed decision should be what kind of academic results are the ESA students that are attending private schools or being homeschooled achieving. So those would be the three reforms that I think that voucher supporters should advance forward, rather than risk what may happen if the problems aren't fixed, and voucher opponents take advantage of them to do far more extensive restrictions and intrusions for the program.
Henry, on this, I think what Bob's right on is this initiative in its own right is a bit ingenious, and that there's, I don't know, probably 40% of the state who doesn't like homeschooling, they don't like vouchers, they don't like any of the issues where the money would follow the student. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are independents or independent-minded anyway. They may be Republicans or Democrats, but they look at it and say, hey, I'd like to try to get results. And Bob has kind of addressed the results, I think, in multiple ways. One, making certain that it's being spent correctly. And the second one is at least having testing that we can see what the results are. I don't know. I might go further than that, which is I think that there are not a lot, I don't know what the percentage is, but some parents who are doing homeschooling, who are just utilizing it to subsidize income. That's why they're charging all these other crazy types of items. And I am concerned about those kids getting a good education. Some parents do a great job of homeschooling. We've seen results out of homeschooled kids that have just been fabulous in a variety of different places. But it also is a place for abuse, and the victim of that abuse ends up being the kid. Any event, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think big picture, Arizona is not performing as well as it should in education. We're not having enough kids graduate high school. We're not having enough kids go to college, and we're not having enough kids graduate from college from here in the state. I teach at Arizona State University, which has the aspiration of having 200,000 online students, and yet we have a college going rate of our Arizona kids, which is very low in comparison in the nation. And so, there's a big disconnect here between an institution that can grant degrees to 200,000 students from all over the world, and yet we can't get our own kids here in Arizona to go to college and to better themselves and to better the state. And that's what the education programs have to be directed to at the end of the day. And I agree with almost everything that you both said, that these spending programs are going to open themselves up to criticism. I would say that the ESA program is probably, for the state level policy items, probably the biggest item that the Democrats are campaigning on this year. So it's obviously a form of some vulnerability of the Republicans. The Democrats are sensing that. And so the advocates of school choice have to get out ahead of this. I would also agree with you, Paul, that it has to be framed in pragmatic terms. The 40% of people who are out there who don't like private schools, who don't like charter schools, who don't like vouchers, etc., they probably have very laudable motives. They think that if all the resources and all the kids went into the public schools, that the public schools would improve. But the problem is that hasn't been the case historically, and even when the state has directed a lot more resources into the public schools, they have not improved. And so for students and parents, in the short run, they have to be able to make pragmatic decisions that allow them to better their students' education. And these sorts of programs, subsidizing private schools, having charter schools, even giving people money to help facilitate the homeschooling, can all help in a system where the public schools are failing them, and that can't be changed by any individual student or family. So I think that people have to be encouraged to do these things to get around a system that's failing. But I also agree with the testing. I'm a pretty big fan of centralized testing. I was rigorously tested by the New Zealand central government in my high school years. It didn't do me any harm, and I think it did a lot of people, including me, probably a lot of good. So I'm a big fan of centralized testing. I would have absolutely no problem at all if everyone who received an ESA was required take one of these tests and hopefully also attribute it back to the private school that they're at as well, right? So that there's transparency around the performance of those schools, so parents know what they're getting when they go and spend their tax credits or their hard-earned dollars there.
The point that you made that sticks with me is I think that first I'm a big fan of Basis and Great Heart Schools. I think that those two school charters have done a fabulous job with kids, and I know there are a number of other charters that have as well. Not all charters are equal. There are some charters that have done a pretty poor job, but boy, the kids who are performing the best in the state are coming out of charters. I also like the idea that if a parent is sending their kid to a private school or if they're homeschooling them, that they should have the same right or access to capital that the rest of us have. They're paying the taxes in. They should get some back. I don't know if I agree with Bob completely on the means test, but what I'm really the competition has helped us to see how much better we can do if we want to. But I don't see any real reform happening in the traditional schools that would look at what benefits that we're gaining from this and figure out how to make it work. When I was mayor, we took the city and divided it up into 4 parts, and we allowed the private sector to bid on our garbage service. Now, the private sector, when they implemented one-man trucks. You had to pick up 700 cans a day. They were able to dramatically cut the actual overall cost for the city in every section that they went into. And finally, when we got to the last section, the city workers decided that maybe they were going to go from a 3-man truck to a 1-man truck. They were going to automate it. They were going to have people pick up 700 cans a day. Now, before we did that, I'm telling you, they were ready for a job action to go from 3-man trucks to 1-man trucks. They hated the idea. If you went back to those unions today and said, you know what, you were right in the beginning, we're going to go back to 3-man trucks, there'd be a job action on that today. They'd be talking about how terrible it was to have to use your hands, to be in the back of the truck, to the dangers that came from it. But once they reformed, they actually were able to see some economic benefits that happen. Now, I think the city went overboard. They've basically taken all those back from the private sector. And I think the private sector being in there provides a benefit to the taxpayer. But my point here is, in traditional schools, I think there's a lot that we can learn from charters and private schools that we ought to be trying to pick back up, because parents today are walking away from those schools. We've lost about 100,000 kids in a 10-year period of time. Now, to be fair, some of that was childbirth, but nonetheless, a lot of it was parents saying, I want something better. And I just don't know that the traditional schools have picked up the standards that they need to do it, or at least not enough of them to make a difference. All right, so I'm going to shift to one last issue. I sent you guys both an article on The Economist. To me, it's kind of a fun subject. And it came into play for me this weekend in Tucson. I don't think I have it here. You can take that off. But it came into play with me in Tucson. I went up and met with a group of lawyers there, and I was given a lot of grief about the Arizona Independent Party and how terrible we are. And in any event, long story short, besides the fact that they didn't like me to start with, or at least some, yeah. But it was, I'll tell you, I liked them. This is the truth. They were smart. They were really smart. And I like being challenged. I like people challenging my ideas and making me think about it and think about, hey, am I doing the right thing? And am I utilizing the right values? But one of the issues that came up was I had used Senator Graham's book. I don't know if you remember that, Bob, but the book basically talked about economic income inequality. And he made a very good point that said, okay, even though inequality exists from people who are at the lowest pay to the highest pay, if you take a look at the taxing or the dollar amount that they're being taxed at the top end and the transfer payments going to the people at the bottom, we're actually better today than we've been in the last 100 years, that the income inequality is actually less. The article that I sent you this week was about how governments become a little bit of a Robin Hood. But the point that I think the author was really trying to make is if you are a progressive and your goal was to try to equalize out the payments, if that's who you were, you should take a look at whether or not you really want to slow people's income at the top, recognizing that there's a huge amount of benefit that's being given to people at the bottom in everything from transfer payments, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and it's dramatically better than it's ever been. I found the article to be interesting. I'd love to get both of your guys' viewpoints on this as we close this out. Bob?
I also enjoyed the article. It looked at after-tax income and the redistributive effects of tax policy in the United States and in other industrialized democracies, and found that when you look at after-tax income, there has not been a big increase in inequality. Phil Graham went further and added the impact of transfer payments and welfare benefits, and came up with even more dramatic results that we are not, when you consider both taxes and transfer payments, at all the stratified society that the critique has. I think that there's actually beginning to be a recognition on the left of the point that you made, which used to be standard fare in democratic circles, that if you want to give a bigger slice of the pie to those at the lower levels, the best way to do that is to build a bigger pie. And the opposition to the wealth tax that you're seeing swelling in California, as well as the rejection of that idea in France, I think suggests that while that the lessons of the Reagan-Thatcher era may have had more durability than I thought they had, given the infatuation with socialism, renewed infatuation that occurs in certain parts of the left. But within many parts of the left, I think there's a recognition of that. And this article sort of underscored and quantified what I think is more instinctively being felt on a broader scale on the left than I anticipated. Manabe is an exception.
Yes, that's true. So, and there was at least one person in this particular group that might have really been a Mamdani supporter. But when I was asked a question about the wealth tax in California, which all of us know, what they're talking about doing is taking people at the way upper end, people who are billionaires, not people who are making $1 billion a year, but people who are worth $1 billion a year. Go take some government regulators and have them establish what the value is of that person's life and their savings and their asset investment. And then once that bureaucrat decides what the value is, and they could put a tax on you and you have 3 years to be able to pay it off. And so you just have to go liquidate your assets if you didn't have enough there, which obviously would, well, I said I was a big supporter of it, mainly because I think we should put up big billboards all over California and say, move to Arizona. This is the better place for you to be. I think it's a terrible error on their behalf. But to give credit, I think you're right. Governor Newsom has been big supporter or big opposition to this particular tax. Henry, I'll give you last words on this.
I think the debate about inequality is very 2012. It feels very Barack Obama to me. And the debate on tariffs and immigration feels very 2016. I think that we are past all of this. I think we're going to be debating how to pay for all of our old people. This is the fight that is coming. Every developed economy in Japan, Korea, it is extremely dramatic. Their populations are essentially going to halve by the end of this century. The American population is going to slightly increase. The European populations are going to slightly decline, but become much, much older. And all of those people are not going to be working. They're going to require, they're going to be working longer, but they're not going to be able to work beyond a certain point. They're going to require healthcare expenditures, and all of those burdens are going to fall not on, quote unquote, the poor, but on the young. And so I think that that's going to be the big debate around welfare states in the future. And maybe the dystopian debate about the fact that none of us work anymore, but that AI does everything. But I don't even want to touch that. We don't have time to even touch on that. But yeah, the debate about inequality feels very 2012 to me.
Henry, I'm just going to say this. Bob and I are the tail end of the boomers, right? We might have even been the generation right after it. you young people need to pay your taxes. It's going to be important for us in the future.
We are going to become the world champions in tax evasion. My generation. Watch us. Just watch us.
All right, guys. Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys being on today.
Great to see you.
Good to be with you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.